Hello everybody, Brian from Witch Doctor. How we all doing? The purpose of this test was to look at atmospheric variables and factors and how they impact precision and ballistics. Just to at the outset, all this testing was done in a city called University Place in Washington State in the United States of America at one location. So one of the variables in the study is a constant variable, which would be elevation. So I did not go around Washington or any other region of the world and do this testing. It was all done at the same elevation at the same range. So wherever you are in the world, your results may vary from these, which is why I want to stress that any absolute values that you see in this data may not apply to your particular region of the world or your atmosphere. Okay, so what we did is we took that 6 ppc Bat Nouveau rifle that I've been using with a lot of my tests, and I took the Hodenstein 67 grain bullets, and very good load. Was shooting really well with this particular barrel. Used N133 powder. All the shooting was done at 100 yards so that I can reduce the impact of any kind of wind effects or other types of things that may have been going on during the testing. I will say that most of the testing I had flags out there, and pretty much everything was shot in calm conditions. Sometimes there was mild wind conditions, but they were very predictable, and even so, we shot well through some of the mild wind conditions. I went ahead and grabbed a Kestrel 5700 Elite so that I can get all kinds of different atmospheric data. It's a tool that can measure a number of different things: humidity, temperature, station pressure, etc. I captured velocity data with a lab radar, and I measured groups using the center-to-center method. Velocity is represented here in feet per second, and all the groups that were shot were 5-shot groups. I used a powder charge of N133 at 29.9 grains. That one seemed to have been the best precision out of any other type of load. All right, let's look at the results of atmospherics and precision. So we collected data on measures of atmospheric condition and precision, which in this study is called group size. Precision, that's a great way to measure precision, is your group size center to center. I went ahead and did some correlations using regression models among the different variables, and I looked at probability as to whether there was a real effect going on or not. The results show that station pressure is a statistically significant factor in predicting group size. When the station pressure was high, group size was smaller. There appears to be a cutoff in the data, interestingly enough. If you look closely at the data here, you have a regression. Group size is over here, and over here is station pressure. And you can tell that the group sizes were generally pretty small when station pressure was above 29.8. When it went below 29.8, the group sizes grew significantly. Okay, so that was statistically significant, and station pressure accounted for 30% of the variation in precision. So it was a massive variable. In simple terms, this means that roughly 1/3 of your group size is affected by station pressure. This does make intuitive sense, given that low pressure is associated with like high turbulence in the air, and high station pressure is associated with low turbulence. If you've ever observed, I don't know, a smokestack or somebody smoking a cigarette, whatever it may be, when it's a high pressure environment, the smoke kind of just sits and it settles, and you can see there's nothing turbulent in that smoke. Whereas in low pressure days, the smoke is rising fast, it's going all over the place, and it's everywhere. and that represents basically unstable air. Okay, now looking at relative humidity, that had no impact on precision. When you looked at the data, the scatter plot of the data, you see that it actually did not significantly correlate at all. There was no relationship between relative humidity and group size. You can see, though, that most of the shooting was done in here in the Pacific Northwest and Washington State. We have a generally high humid environment, so most of the testing was done when it was about 80% or higher humidity. I was able to go out on a day when we had low humidity at around 42% and shoot several groups to see if that impacted at all the group size, which it didn't. Temperature in Fahrenheit did not correlate with precision either. However, but if you look at this, though, you can see once again that there was a cluster here where the temperature ranges from the high 30s to the high 50s. Again, that's kind of our atmosphere up here most of the time. It's hoodie weather. But I was able to go out on some warmer days and collect some data and found collectively it didn't really impact groups at all. So in summary, in terms of precision, the only variable, atmospheric variable that I was able to collect that correlated with precision was station pressure. Okay, let's look at ballistics and precision. I shot 8 more 5-shot groups at charges that were different from the well-tuned 29.9 grain load, just because I wanted to test a range of different loads. So I shot from 29.3 to 29.8 and had 37 total 5-shot groups, which included the 29.9 grain load. I did get a range of values across the spectrum of ballistics data that I wanted to test and see if this velocity node idea has some merit to it in this data. Velocity node idea is this idea that there are relatively distinct ranges of velocity where there's ideal precision. In this test, the velocities ranged from 33.25 feet per second to 33.97 feet per second, which is a range of 72 feet per second. If the hypothesis of a velocity node is correct, then on the scatter plot of values, we should see clusters of values that show better precision relative to other values. What we found was for velocity, this is not the case. It didn't matter what the velocity was, the groups were all over the place. There really was no trend or pattern there. Same thing with standard deviation. The velocity standard deviation of the 5-shot groups had no association with precision. Same thing with extreme spread. Extreme spread had no association with precision. Although I did get a probability value of 0.13, which at least got close to the 0.05 cutoff that is industry standard, but still above 0.05. And so none of these measures of ballistics, velocity, standard deviation, or extreme spread had any association with precision. We examined atmospherics and ballistics and looked at the interrelationships among atmospheric variables and ballistic data. In that, we found that velocity correlated with humidity and temperature. There were no other statistically significant correlations except for those two. So standard deviation and extreme spread did not correlate at all with station pressure, humidity, or temperature. And velocity did not correlate with station pressure. It only correlated with humidity and temperature. The correlation with humidity and velocity was greater than with temperature and velocity. And, it's notable that relative humidity was associated with velocity, a pretty strong correlation, and the trend in the relationship is shown in this graph here. The trend in the relationship is that the higher the relative humidity, the lower the velocity.
Now, this finding is intriguing given that higher humidity is supposed to be associated with lower air density and therefore less resistant on the bullet, and you'd expect higher velocities from that. We sort of found the opposite, which is interesting. Temperature exhibited an association with velocity, and the greater the temperature, the higher the velocity. And this makes intuitive sense given that higher temperatures are associated with lower air density, which in turn should reduce the resistance on the bullet and lead to higher velocities as the temperature goes up. And we certainly found that, which made intuitive sense. So I went ahead and explored the interrelationships between humidity and temperature effects on velocity because of that intriguing finding that we found that we didn't expect there with the direction of the correlation with humidity and velocity. And so what I used was called a multiple regression, where I utilized humidity and temperature as predictors of velocity at the same time. This statistical method informs us of whether there are any independent effects of humidity and or temperature while accounting for each other in the statistical model. That's not something that was done with a simple correlation where you simply just look at the association between velocity and humidity and velocity and temperature. This one is velocity and temperature as they relate to, this one is humidity and temperature as they relate to velocity at the same time. The results of this multiple regression did show that humidity and temperature accounted for 61.3% of the variability in velocity, and it was statistically significant. Humidity was the only variable to have an independent relationship with velocity in the model. Okay, so this is where it says it accounted for 61.3% of the variation in velocity. This says it's statistically significant. Now here's where it gets very interesting. The interaction between humidity and temperature has changed from the simple correlation that we did above, where temperature used to be a positive relationship, where as temperature goes up, velocity goes up. When relative humidity is entered into the equation with temperature, the direction of the association actually flips and it turns into a negative correlation. So this is a interesting statistical thing that occurs once in a while. And it could be called a reciprocal suppressor variable. No, not a suppressor that you would put, on your rifle to suppress muzzle blast and noise. It's basically where correlation between like humidity and velocity or temperature and velocity are not true relationships until both are analyzed together. And then when they're analyzed together, the true relationship becomes apparent. My collective interpretation of all of these analyses is that temperature and humidity do have some sort of an interactive effect. And since most of the data collected for this test occurred in cooler temperatures where we expect slower velocities, the effects of high humidity during those cooler temperatures did not potentiate or play out to the extent that we would expect. To fully understand these interactive effects, we would need to collect a lot more data among a wide variation of humidity and temperature to more fully understand how they interact. So in conclusion, the data support the theory that atmospheric conditions determine the precision and affect ballistic performance. Atmospheric conditions may show distinct cutoff values where the precision degrades considerably if you continue to use the same load after you have passed the cutoff value. The results of this test indicate that station pressure has the largest impact on precision, and indicators of air density, like humidity and temperature, determine bullet velocity and may have an interactional impact on velocity. In practical terms, shooters should be aware that, in lower station pressure conditions, their precision is likely to degrade, and there may be a distinct cutoff value that signifies a major drop in precision. And humidity and temperature are determinants of velocity, and there may be a complex relationship between humidity and temperature and how it impacts velocity. I've certainly witnessed the atmospheric conditions firsthand several times. I have several examples of these different effects, but I will go over one in particular that seemed to have been the most pronounced for me. I was shooting a short-range bench rest match where we shot five shot groups at 100 yards and five shot groups at 200 yards. I did not have any time to engage in load development for the match. And so what I ended up doing was just picking the load that had worked for me the month prior. That load was 29.9 grains of N133 with a particular bullet seated in the same spot that I seated it the month before. I did notice that station pressure that morning was much lower than the usual. Usually station pressure out here is 29.8 and above. That day it was 29.63. In my testing, I knew that there was a cutoff where if it was lower than 29.8, precision would degrade significantly if I had utilized the same load that I had utilized the month before. I proceeded to the first match and I brought several bullets. I did what's called testing loads. So I had 8 bullets filled with 29.9 and another 8 filled with 29.7. I really had no reason to try a lower charge because I really didn't evaluate whether the lower charge would be helpful, but I just knew that I had to do something different. And so that was kind of my first guess is let's just try this with 0.2 of a grain lower. The 29.7 grain load when I shot a 3-shot group at the sighter target showed much better precision than the 29.9 that I shot at the sighter target. So what I ended up doing was taking those additional 5 at 29.7 and shooting those on my record target. And they did pretty good. Not great, but good enough. After that match, I was sitting next to a prominent bench rest shooter who I was right next to at the loading bench, and he complained of a big group. You know, normally after we shoot a match, we go to the loading bench to start reloading, and hey, how'd you do? Well, I didn't do great. You know, how'd you do? I did okay, right? And then we start kind of talking about things. And so I asked him, hey, are you going to change your load? You know, because it seems like you weren't too happy with that one. He said, oh, yeah. I said, well, how much are you going to change it? He said, half a grain. And I'm going to go down half a grain. And I told him, oh, I dropped, 0.2 grains, and that improved my situation. He said, well, I'm going to drop half a grain. In my experience, that seems to, work in these kind of situations. So I went ahead and I loaded 29.4, which was half a grain drop, from the month prior. And I went ahead and loaded 8, and on the sighter for that match, I shot both the 29.7 and the 29.4. And the 29.4 was better than 29.7. So I went ahead and stayed with the 29.4 load for the rest of the match and ended up placing in the top 3 overall, which is pretty difficult when you're actually having to adjust your load during the match. Most people come into those loads preloaded, ready to go. I discussed that match with the prominent shooter, and he indicated that, like me, he didn't have time to do any load development at the range the day before. But he has enough experience that when a load, quote unquote, blows up, or when your precision significantly degrades to the point where your target looks like a shotgun pattern, basically, he'll either drop the charge, 0.5 grains, and this is with N133 powder. He also said he will change the bullet. He typically will bring a couple different bullets with him. Or he'll switch powders. Sometimes he brings different powders. He'll bring LT32 and N133 to matches, and some other powders. He's been known to bring 3 or 4 different powders, in fact. He indicated that in some weather conditions, a flat-based bullet may work better than a bow tail. When I asked him exactly what type of weather conditions, he said, well, like today, cold and rainy, real crappy. Well, we have a lot of cold and rainy days in our area here during the spring and winter. And we definitely will have days where the station pressure is cold and rainy, but it's above 29.8, and I get pretty good precision on those days. It seems really that it's the station pressure being below 29.8, not whether it's cold and rainy, that seems to be the major predictor of precision. Okay, and then I went ahead and talked to several different shooters and asked them, hey, do you guys have strategies for when your load blows up? And they verbalized kind of the same thing. In fact, some shooters even said, I'll bring a backup rifle where I will just, if I'm shooting bad on my first match, I will just pull out my backup rifle. So it seems like people understand that there are atmospheric conditions that could impact precision. I don't think they necessarily can pinpoint it, though. I think what this test does is it really pinpoints it. Another notable lesson from this is I learned that this velocity node idea really didn't explain the situations that were faced by us that day. In terms of velocity node theory, many of us were shooting within our velocity node, but we were showing very poor results. It was after reducing our charge that the groups shrunk and precision improved. And the recorded velocities were very different. So in 29.7, my velocity on average was 3366. With 29.4, my average was 3339. Whereas velocity node theory would say that my node it should be around 3388, which is what I accomplished with 29.9. But if I would have continued at that velocity node with that load, I would have placed dead last in that match for sure. So anyway, there may just be an atmospheric phenomenon where high pressure loads do best in high station pressure and low pressure loads do better in low station pressure. Really don't know for sure, but we'll continue testing in low station pressure conditions to kind of assess further to see what strategies may work better or worse. In terms of recommendations, definitely pay attention to atmospheric effects wherever you shoot, regardless of your shooting discipline or purpose. Really, without understanding how atmospherics affects precisions and ballistics, you're likely to underperform and lack the ability to explain the outcomes of your shooting. By understanding the atmospheric effects, you can make either precise or even best guessed estimates of when and how to adjust for atmospheric conditions, which will improve your precision and confidence in your ability to perform well. Certainly when you shoot well, your confidence gets better. Also, you can develop strategies for how to cope with variations in atmospherics. So some of the things that I do is, I look at the atmosphere and the weather forecast and see, is a cold front coming in? Is a low pressure system coming in? All those different things. And I want to know if it is, when is it going to hit? So I know when to be prepared to make some adjustments. Be prepared to adjust a previously developed load. If you're preloaded, this is where tuners are very helpful for this type of situation because you can take preloaded ammunition that under the current atmosphere is no longer precise for you and you can tune it to precision. I've also heard people say that they load for low station pressure conditions, that they have a particular bullet that flies better when the air is thinner, and they have that load ready to go when they come to a match. So even developing a load for low pressure conditions is something that you can do. Definitely assess your velocity in the current atmosphere so that you have the accurate velocity to input into your ballistic software. This is extremely important for precision rifle series, National Rifle League kind of matches, tactical matches where you do a lot of adjustments to your ups and downs in your scope because you're shooting at variable distances. So you have to have a very accurate velocity. So bring some form of chronograph with you to every match and definitely chronograph before the match so you have the most accurate velocity. Check your ballistics calculator to see if it allows you to enter atmospheric variables such as temperature and or humidity in relation to velocity measurements. Also see if your software will calculate expected adjustments to ballistics within differing atmospheres. Be prepared to make educated guesses if you really can't do any of these other strategies. And I do recommend conducting testing similar to this type of testing so that you can assess the impacts of atmospherics in your particular part of the world. This will help you understand what's important for your particular part of the world. Okay, and some of the limitations to this were, again, we shot all this in the same exact region of the world where we had some constrained variables, so we didn't get a very wide spread of different values on humidity and temperature. So that was one of the limitations to the study. Another one is we shot in the exact same spot, which had the exact same altitude. So we really we're not unable to collect any data on altitude. So if you're in a different region of the world, for example, Denver, Colorado, United States, the variables that are important to you at that elevation may be very different than the variables that are important to me at basically at sea level here in Washington. However, you can utilize the same methods of testing that we used here to understand how the atmospherics impact your precisions and ballistics in your part of the world. Okay, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe, like, and share.